So welcome everyone back to our third session. I'm Eileen Sweeney from the Philosophy Department at BC, and I'm very happy to be here introducing the session. It's been a wonderful conference. I want to thank Jonathan for bringing this all together. It's really been amazing. So our first speaker this afternoon is Jeannie Miller. Jeannie Miller is an associate professor of classical Arabic literature in the Near and Middle Eastern Studies Department at the University of Toronto. She's the author of several articles on Al-Jāḥiẓ. No, did I do it? I did it wrong now. Jāḥiẓ. As well as the Quibbler, Al-Jāḥiẓ equivocations in Kitab al-Hayawan and beyond. Her talk today, which part of it, well, you'll have to ask us which way, or you have to tell us which way you want the order to have gone, was Al-Jāḥiẓ on Jews and Christians, New Reflections.
Yes. So, to introduce Al-Jāḥiẓ, Amr ibn Baḥr Al-Jāḥiẓ was a Mu'tazili theologian, polymath, and literary compiler of the 9th century CE, who is credited with laying the groundwork for the development of Arabic literary culture, or adab, in later centuries. His treatise, Refutation of the Christians, or Radd ala Nasara, is an important early source for Muslim attitudes about Christians and Jews, as well as 9th century polemical arguments. The text opens by citing specific critiques of the Quran supposedly adduced by Christians that will be rebutted. These rebuttals occur in the second half of the epistle, while the first half is more sociological, describing Muslim social perceptions and why Muslims mistakenly preferred Christians to Jews. Now, this treatise was requested by a top courtier and administrator of Turkish background, Al-Fath ibn Khaqan, who died in 861, on behalf of the Caliph al-Mutawakkil, who reigned from 847 to 861. And it was likely responsible for salvaging Al-Jāḥiż's access to patronage following the execution of all his previous patrons within the Abbasid court at the behest of the Caliph al-Mutawakkil. I will highlight today a few different ways that Jāḥiẓ treats the category of religion, deen, and the classification of religious groups at various levels. His approach is comparative, but it displays a process of ranking or an impulse for ranking rather than a completed hierarchy. And I'll be looking at concepts implicit in his rhetoric more so than a fully articulated theory. So I think a lot of the theological ranking systems that we have been looking at in the Islamic tradition, that idea is kind of in the background, but it's not what he's doing in this text or really anywhere in a systematic way. So throughout my overview, however, I want to bring in ethnicity. So I'm going to make the argument that we can understand this polemical epistle better if we place it in the context of his theories on race and ethnicity, another area involving the classification of human groups. And for context, at this time, there were fraught discussions about the relationship between Islam, the Arabic language, and Arab identity. So to argue for the relevance of race and ethnicity to this particular epistle, I would like to point out that Al-Jāḥiẓ has dedicated 2 other works to the same patrons at the same time as Refutation of the Christians. And as I said, this is a special moment in Jāḥiż's own intellectual biography. These 2 other works are his Epistle on the Virtues of the Turks and the Book of Animals. More precisely, these 2 works are rededicated to Al-Fath ibn Khaqan or Al-Mutawakkil with lengthy new introductions. Both of these rededications, these lengthy new introductions, include long theoretical speculation about race and ethnicity and animal species that revolve around a notion of proximity, or qaraba, which we were talking about earlier. An Arabic word, however, that can also describe familial relations. Now, familial relations, I would say, is the predominant theme, if we look at it from a literary perspective, of refutation, the epistle Refutation of the Christians. It comes up throughout the sociological and the doctrinal components of that epistle. By bringing together biology and polemic, or ethnic theory and polemic, I hope to elucidate a few key concepts that may help make sense of Jāḥiż's comparative approach to religions and sects. Deen, or religion, cross-cutting categories, species, ethnic assimilation, and degrees and categories. So before starting in, I want to list a few instances of this theme of familial relations in the Refutation of the Christians to convince you that it is actually an important theme in this text, both as a metaphor for the relationship between religious groups, but also as a scientific concept. So here are some of the polemical arguments that Jāḥiż introduces in relation to familial relationships. So prepare yourselves, these are polemical. Okay, one. Muslims prefer Jews to Christians because Jews were their neighbors in Yathrib, and the enmity among neighbors is similar to the enmity of relatives. They're too close to us, and that is why we don't like them. Jews exhibit more frequent birth defects because they do not intermarry with other groups, and you see this, you quote, you see the same thing in horses, camels, donkeys, and doves. In contrast to Jews being too close in similarity to their family members, Christians are too far away from their family members. For brothers of the same sect will offer different accounts of Christology, even though they share the same mother and father. This, of course, is a familiar accusation of doctrinal division, now with a rhetorical familial twist. And I will discuss that example more later. And then a few more. Christians have many customs that prevent procreation. Celibacy, castration, and the prohibition on taking a new wife, whether through divorce or polygamy. Another example, Jāḥiż sometimes calls one religion the brother of another religion. And last but most extensive, the text's longest doctrinal argument and most involved doctrinal argument has to do with familial appellations, why it is unacceptable to call God Father or to claim that Jesus is his son, even if by adoption. Al-Jāḥiẓ uses a reductio ad absurdum strategy, arguing that if God is a father, then he must be fully embedded in the web of human kinship relations. And so he would be a grandfather, an uncle, an in-law, and so on and so forth. This is meant to be humorous, but it also follows a logical structure of reductio ad absurdum. Okay, so I will start with my this order of topics here on the right. Deen. Al-Jāḥiẓ was aware of a plurality of religions, of course, existing over time and space. He writes that Christians, quote, take from every nation without giving, for each deen follows after another deen. And they took a lot from it, but gave a little. Al-Jāḥiẓ and his opponents often appeal to universal consensus or define what ideas are thinkable by referring to all the religions rhetorically. But what constituted a religion, a community, a tradition, a dialectician present to answer for body of doctrines? Let's try to see. For example, in requesting the treatise, Rebuttal of the Christians, the addressee, possibly Al-Fatih bin Khalqan, cites Christian critiques of the Quran that conclude with the Christians saying, this is something that nobody would take as doctrine, لا يتكلم به إنسان, and is not acknowledged by any of the religions, شيء من الأديان. The inclusion here of the phrase يتكلم به to argue for dialectically or publicly espoused as a doctrine limits the universality of the reference to any of the other religions, limits it to those communities that have a dialectician elite. Similarly, Christians supposedly argued according to the addressee in Refutation of the Christians, these Christians supposedly argued that the Messiah did not speak in the cradle as the Quran claimed. Their argument is that Christians have never claimed such a thing, despite our great number, the diversity of our countries, and the disagreements among us. We have never heard of this, nor do we claim it. Moreover, the Jews have not heard of it, for they say they have only heard of it from you, Muslims. Zoroastrians have not heard of it, Sabaeans have not, nor the servants of the Buddha, whether Indians or others, nor have Turks or Khazars, nor have we heard of this from any of the past peoples or bygone ages, the Gospels, the records of the attributes of the Messiah in books, or good tidings in the tongues of prophets. In recapitulating this argument, to rebut it, Al-Jāḥiẓ later on adds Dailamis to this list, and then when he does rebut it, he adds in two more ethnic groups in an apparent example of one-upmanship. The list of peoples who do not know of this report wavers interestingly between religious groups and ethnic communities, though without identifying them as religions. The relevant commonality here would be their status as a community capable of transmitting knowledge. Al-Jāḥiż's rebuttal, he says, when were the Turks, Khazars, Tatars, and Taylistan ever mentioned in anything of this kind or used for an argument of this type? These other groups do not support any miracles of Jesus or any prophet. When the Christian opponents have sketched whereas the Christian opponents have sketched a global consensus, Al-Jāḥiẓ expels these Turkic ethnic groups on the grounds that they do not participate in the shared prophetic tradition. However, when it suits his rhetorical aims, he's happy to appeal to a universal commonality among the Adyan. And here's an example. His most repeated critique of Christianity is its impenetrable Christology. If you strive as hard as you can and gather all your wits to understand their doctrine on the Messiah, you will not be able to do it so as to understand the definition, had, of Christianity, especially their doctrine on godhood. How could you, when if you speak in private with an historian and ask him about their doctrines on the Messiah, he will tell you one thing, but if you speak in private with his own brother, born of the same mother and father, who is an historian as well, and asked him about their doctrines on the Messiah, he will give you something contrary to his own brother and And the word there is sinu, which means not just of the same father, but of the same father and mother. So it's an unusual word, and he's getting really into the specificity of those familial relationships. This is true of all of them, Melkites and Jacobites too. That is why we cannot understand the reality, haqiqa, of Christianity as we do for all the other religions. Al-Jāḥiẓ treats Christianity as exceptional, rhetorically impugning its classification even as a religion in the first place, as it fails to articulate its definition or category boundaries and its reality or essence. Just as above, the Christians made a link between what a religion can possibly believe and what can be dialectically spoken or espoused by saying, using that word, yatakallam bihi. Here again, it is the failure to engage in dialectic that is at stake. Al-Jāḥiż's caustic conclusion to this passage makes the stakes clear. They claim that religion does not emerge through argument, nor does it stand on problemata, nor is it established through disputational trial. Rather, it is by submitting to what is in the books and blindly following the previous generation. By my life, whoever espouses a religion like theirs has no choice but to defend it with this defense. Now, Al-Jāḥiż's horror at the supposed Christian retreat from dialectical argument mirrors his own description of Ahmed ibn Hanbal's response to the dialectical questioning of the previous caliph's inquisition, or mihna, which had now been abandoned by the new caliph al-Mutawakkil to Al-Jāḥiż's dismay. And this person, Ahmed ibn Hanbal, is of course the founder of one of the final of the 4 Islamic schools of law, which Al-Jāḥiż opposed. When asked whether the Quran was created, Ahmed ibn Hanbal said, according to Jāḥiż's account, "Lestu bimutakallim." I am not a dialectician, or more literally, I will not speak. These, which he found totally the epitome of just a horrible approach. These retreats from speech are anathema to a Mu'tazili Muslim kalam mentality that completely identified the pursuit of truth with the pursuit of accurate, non-contradictory speech. This approach can be discerned in the phrase Al-Jāḥiż uses to defend potentially anthropomorphic Quran idioms. Each one of them is true and permissible in speech. Kullun sidqun wa ja'izun fil kalam. It's not about how they ought to be interpreted, but rather the validity and meaningfulness of the Quranic idioms themselves according to the accepted norms of the Arabic language. So the onus is not on the interpreters, the onus is on the accepted norms of the Arabic language in using idiom. Okay, so in sum, the notion of deen or religion packed a rhetorical punch precisely because of its universal application, which operated comparably to a list of geographical and ethnic groups. But for Al-Jāḥiż and his associates, there was an implicit expectation that a deen participate in dialectic in dialectic. Cross-cutting categories. Next topic. I'll wait to give you the quote. Okay. In Book of Animals, Al-Jāḥiẓ critiques the hierarchical classification outlined in Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle's logic, arguing instead for the existence of cross-cutting taxonomic categories. Animals are divided into walking, swimming, flying, and creeping, but each of these categories has carnivores and herbivores. Properly speaking, then, locomotion and diet are cross-cutting categories operating at the same level within the taxonomy. In the same way, Al-Jāḥiẓ never provides a hierarchical or fully schematized classification of doctrinal systems, but instead labels them with certain standard heresiological tags. Jabriya for fatalism, broadly speaking. Tashbih for anthropomorphism, and so on. These tags can themselves be cross-cutting, for they are not mutually exclusive, and they can apply to groups within the major religions or even to individuals. The conclusion of Refutation of the Christians makes this clear. I missed part of the quote here in the slide. I'm quoting now. We would fully rout the Christians if we were to speak on anthropomorphism, for this is the doctrine of most of them, and their community, jama'atuhum, follows it, excepting those dialecticians and natural scientists among them, mutakalimihim wa falasifatihim, who disagree, for they espouse anthropomorphism and incarnation and so forth, ... But anthropomorphism is bad enough on its own, and it is a doctrine common to the Jews and their brothers, ikhwa, the Rafida, namely those who reject the first three caliphs, in other words, proto-Shiites, and their demons among the Muslim anthropomorphists, the Hashwiya, perhaps also to be associated with Ahmed ibn Hanbal and his Baghdadi hadith-oriented followers, and the Nabita, a poorly understood designation, apparently for a certain newly arising Persian group. And these are considered the divergent among people. God Almighty is the only recourse. Jāḥiẓ makes it clear here that anthropomorphism can be a characteristic of an individual, a religion, or a group within a religion at any level of generality and at any level of sort of coherence. He lists Judaism side by side with individual Christian philosophers, and he lists Muslim groups at extremely varied levels of sectarian coherence, from the Rafida, who could be considered a movement, those he calls the Hashwiya, which were a quite defined local Baghdadi group, and then the Nabita, which appeared to be more of a loosely coherent social phenomenon that he himself is naming and observing. Okay, so in keeping with our theme of family relations, I just want to point out his use of the word brothers here, to suggest, without telling us in what way or why, that these Rafida, what he calls Rafida, are somehow closer to Jews, even though all of these categories share the same heresiological tag of anthropomorphists. Okay, species. In Book of Animals, Al-Jāḥiẓ cites a number of disputes between Kalam practitioners that combine a natural science interest in taxonomy with a lexicographic investigation of class names. By using lexicography and biology as their evidence, the debaters merge questions about semantics with questions about natural classes. This kind of argumentation specifically has no precedent in the scientific literature being translated from Greek and Syriac at that time, as far as I know, and it seems to arise in this early 9th century Kalam milieu, Kalam being Islamic theology. A central issue had to do with what taxonomic level constituted a species, which they call one thing, shay' wahid. So what is one thing? Were goats and sheep a single species? Buffalo and cattle? Bactrian camels and dromedaries? Dogs, foxes, hyenas and jackals? Horses and donkeys? Cats, panthers, tigers, leopards, and lions? Can all flying insects, including bees, be considered a species of the fly? Those were the questions that these theologians were pondering. These disputers drew on the biological concepts of proximity, qaraba, common qualities, sifat, and the degree of difference between creatures, ikhtilaf, tabayun, or tafawut, which also use sort of spatial metaphors, while combining these criteria with lexicographical evidence, and so on. Okay. Every time without fail, these kalam practitioners argue by analogy, comparing the degree of difference between one pair of creatures to the degree of difference between another. An important aim seems to have been to calibrate a shared understanding of the specific degree of difference defining a single species. Jāḥiẓ articulates his own opinion, rejecting the idea that species should be defined as the set of animals that interbreed. He instead defines it based on a particular degree of resemblance, or mushakala, family connection or proximity, muqaraba, and distance, tabayun. Namely, the degree of similarity exhibited by animals of a single species was precisely the degree of similarity exhibited among human races. The human races represent, in his view, a standard by which to assess how much difference can exist between breeds of a single species. Now, he apparently had a magnified perception of racial difference, for the result is that he deems several animal categories that today we treat as genera to instead be a single species. Sheep and goats are one species, even though they don't interbreed, donkeys and horses, and so on. Part of his purpose in proposing these large species categories is to keep open the possibility of flexible boundaries, as in interbreeding, between these kinds, while categorically rejecting interspecies crossbreeding, a phenomenon reported by Aristotle. So his system is at once messier and also more sealed off than Aristotle's is. The assessment of family resemblance or proximity, qaraba, is a key intellectual tool used in rebuttal of the Christians. In the doctrinal dispute about whether God may have, quote, adopted Jesus as his son rather than begetting him in the same way that God adopted Ibrahim as his khalil or friend, a Quranically supported phrase, Khalil Allah. To properly rebut this claim, Al-Jāḥiẓ cites a debate between his teacher Nalam and a Muslim proponent of the doctrine that you can call Jesus the Son of God by adoption. And Nalam's argument is based on species divisions. If you adopt a dog, you cannot linguistically call it your son, whereas if you adopt a boy, you can. Since God is also of a different species than humans, you cannot call Jesus God's son. Jāḥiẓ rebukes his teacher publicly, arguing that the same logic applies to the word friend. You would not call the dog your friend either, in Arabic, of course, although we do in English. And he gives an alternate interpretation of the Quranic appellation of Khalil Allah, that Abraham is not the friend of God, but the one who is tried by God. Okay. Now, I would like to talk a little about ethnic assimilation. Okay, so we don't have time for a complete explanation of how names work, but I can give you kind of a hint of how complicated and well theorized or extensively theorized was the relationship between the name of something and its status in Al-Jāḥiż's thought and Islamic theology at this time. Okay, so the context is a discussion of ethnic and cultural assimilation through the Islamic legal construct of clientage, or wala, which allowed non-Arabs to affiliate themselves as clients to Arab tribes, a practice common in the early years after conquest upon conversion to Islam. So what transformations might conversion and the ensuing ethnic clientage imply? In Virtues of the Turks, the patron of the Epistle, Al-Fat, names several criteria making up ethnic identity, namely language, appearance, character traits, customs, and legal status. Both Al-Jāḥiẓ and Al-Fat are trying to explain and justify the perceived Arabization of Persians and other client populations. Al-Jāḥiẓ writes, if the client is transferred to the category of Arabs in most real qualities and is called one of them on account of a majority of the real causes, this is no more astonishing than he who calls an uncle father or an ally one of the tribe. He's using technical terms from physical theory here and argues that calling clients Arabs is an example of meaningful idiomatic speech. We might conclude that clients are not really Arabs, but we're just calling them that as a token of acceptance, but this is not what he is arguing. Rather, he gives great significance to the fact that this idiom can be accurately used. This becomes clear when he and Al-Fat discuss the case of the first client, Ismail, the non-Arab Ismail, the son of Ibrahim, the non-Arab progenitor of one of the two biggest Arab tribal groupings, Adnan. In this passage, Al-Fath uses the same technical terms that usually apply to biological species, and perhaps we see here a more ideal degree of difference within a community than what was described earlier with Jews and Christians. Since the Arabs are one, they are indistinguishable in upbringing, language, and character. Their atoms are similar and their temperaments resemble one another. They, that is the descendants of Ismail, became even more strongly similar than many of those sharing a womb in the general and specific, in agreement and difference, etc. These causes became a second birth so that eventually they married according to it and became in-laws on account of it. So the assimilation of Ismail's offspring into the category of Arabs has been so complete that it extends to biological temperament and even the very atoms composing the body. This is not only because of intermarriage, but also, and first, because of what he calls a second birth, namely upbringing, language, and character, what we would call culture. Now, Jāḥiẓ offers a different interpretation of the Ismail story, emphasizing not the gradual assimilation of the offspring, but rather a sudden, miraculous transformation of Ismail himself. By analogy, he seems to be suggesting that it is not only the second or third generation Persian clients who have become Arabized, but rather that when people become clients, their assimilation is immediate. He says, they called Ismail, son of foreigners, an Arab, for God made his tongue eloquent with clear Arabic, free of any accent and without learning it. Then he formed his character. He stripped his nature of the natures of foreigners and transferred to his body these atoms, arranging them to create this particular arrangement. Al-Jāḥiż's account of how Ismail became an Arab could be used to argue that assimilation is an exceptional event reserved for prophets, calling into question the validity of the everyday assimilation of ordinary clients. But Jāḥiż takes the argument in the opposite direction. The assimilation of clients, while not miraculous, is similar to Ismail's experience and borrows from it an aura of divine approbation. His argument rests on Islamic law and Arabic idiom, and he cites numerous examples of idioms using familial relationships. According to, so I didn't include the quote, but he states, they are Arabs in law, in their claim, in their name, and in their speech. Jāḥiż argues that when God or the prophet called the clients Arabs, this performative legislative statement did more than just construct a legal category. It affected how language could rightly be used and therefore affected reality, even transferring and transforming atoms and physical features. So this perspective may help make sense of, at least it gives an indication of the importance, like the real referent of idioms, that idioms are not equivalent to literal statements, but they signify something real in a way that I think plays into that doctrinal dispute about calling Jesus son of God by adoption. Okay, and then what was next? Degrees and categories. Oh, yes. This is very short. Despite the stricter divisions that Jāḥiż imposes between species, he did not have a concept of essence as defining a species. Rather, the degree of difference defining a species was an arbitrary threshold on a spectrum defined by comparison to humans. Without a belief in essences, the world is fundamentally understandable only if you can analyze degrees of qualities, for example. So Jāḥiż explicitly associates the ability to think with degrees, darajat, tabaqat, and so on, rather than in absolutes, with an intellectual virtue he calls justice, basically good, balanced judgment, which he argues is the most crucial requirement for leadership. This principle of degrees may also apply to the classification of religions. So in the introduction to Kitab al-Hayawan, Book of Animals, Jāḥiż describes how the book's addressee failed to distinguish this is a hostile addressee that he is totally opposed to. The addressee failed to distinguish between degrees in theopolitical allegiance. The addressee critiques Jāḥiż's robust representation of an opposing Hashemi argument supporting leadership by descendants of Muhammad's daughter Fatima and her husband Ali. And the addressee, so he says of the addressee, "You claimed that by doing this, by robustly representing my opponent's views, I exited the category of the Mu'tazila and entered the category of the Zaydiyya and exited the category of balance and moderation and entered the category of excess and extremism. For the Zaydiyya's statement is an introduction to the Rafida's statement, and the Rafida's statement is an introduction to the Qadiyya's statement." This is a slippery slope fallacy, and it's based on the failure to distinguish between similar beliefs that differ in degree. Now, Jāḥiż doesn't say whether he agrees that these groups' doctrines differ only in degree, but he does not seem to contest it. Instead, his main issue here, especially if you consider how this argument tracks with other arguments that he's lining up together, his main problem is that differences in degree should not be collapsed. Thank you. I don't know how to pick.
Thank you very much. On the question of kalam, I'm interested in the distinction between willingness to engage in speculative theology and actually being able to do it effectively. And perhaps Ahmed ibn Hanbal might have been a great mutakalim, but he refuses to as a matter of principle. Because it strikes me in Jāḥiż's epistle that elsewhere he's concerned about Christians being well educated and Muslims prizing them, esteeming them for their dabbling in philosophy and all this. And so how do those things come together?
It's a bit disingenuous because Christians did publicly debate Kalam practitioners constantly in theological dialectical argument, like all the time, and he knows that we know that. This is a polemical point specifically about areas of Christology that Christians may have said this is something that we accept on faith, rather than like a general refusal to engage in dialectical debate. Did they really say that? I don't know, but he seems to be impugning them with that claim. I mean, maybe he wants to really push on that because he's so upset about Ahmed ibn Hanbal, right? Like, which he can't probably talk about too much at this point, given the politics. Yeah, of course. Sorry. I did my best to put it.
No, it's too hard. That's great. So our second speaker today is Omer Michaelis. Am I saying it? Michaelis? Is an associate professor at Tel Aviv University's Department of Jewish Philosophy and Talmud, and a senior research fellow at the Kogod Research Center at the Shalom Hartman Institute. Specializing in medieval Jewish thought and philosophy in the Islamic world, he focuses on the dynamics of production, transmission, and integration of knowledge in medieval Judaism and in its intersection with parallel processes in the Islamic culture. His talk today is on the interiority in Baḥya ibn Paquda and the plurality of religions.
Shalom. Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for bringing us together, and thank you all for staying with us in this afternoon. To discuss Baḥya ibn Paquda's approach to the plurality of religions, one must undertake two tasks. The first is to demonstrate how Baḥya explicitly addresses the issue in his main work, The Guide to the Duties of the Hearts. What does Baḥya say about the very existence of other religions? And what is the explicit orientation of the author, whose obvious direct addressees are Jews, towards the members of other religions? The second task is to try to understand Baḥya's implied or indirect approach to the plurality of religions as reflected in his overall religious system. This is primarily a synthetic effort that requires first understanding the main principles of the system presented in the Guide to the Duties of the Hearts. Such an effort will allow us to focus on the specific constituents that can teach us something, even if not directly conveyed, about how other religions appear on the horizons of the system. To what extent does the distinction between one religion and another remain significant in Baḥya's thought? Or alternatively, what are the elements that allow this distinction to be diminished? I wish to say a few words, unfortunately very few, on these two issues: Baḥya's direct approach to other religions and the implicit way they are related to in his thought. When I say other religions, I mean almost exclusively Islam and Christianity, leaving those beyond these two for another opportunity, as this issue is more complex, and in any case, Baḥya leaves far fewer traces that allow for a satisfactory clarification of this matter. But before discussing the main question at hand, a few words on the Guide to the Duties of the Hearts, Kitab al-Hidayah ila Faraid al-Qulub, are in order. It was written most likely during the final decades of the 11th century by the Andalusian Baḥya ibn Yusuf. A Geniza fragment reveals that Baḥya hails from Saracusta, that is Saragossa, and that he served the community as Dayan, that is judge, communal judge. Baḥya's primary aim in his work is to shift the gravity of religious life, as I've argued elsewhere, also the life of religious duties, the prohibited and the permitted, inward into the human soul. Instead of acts performed by the bodily members, Baḥya offers a shift of focus to mental activities carried out by a special organ, the soul or the heart, which is not outwardly manifest to the public eye as the rest of the members. Instead of an emphasis on bodily practices such as fasting, sleep deprivation, or excessive praying, a shift towards spiritual exercises like taming and transforming human desire for worldly objects, and engaging in rigorous self-accounting attuned to the subtlest fluctuations of the soul. Instead of an instrumental attitude towards objects, a shift towards a more contemplative approach that reveals their place in the grand order of divine creation. Baḥya presents these changes not only and not primarily as ways to enrich or deepen one's religious life, but as commandments that together form a framework that is, on the one hand, analogous, and on the other hand, hierarchically superior to the familiar set of 313 commandments listed in other books of commandments circulating in Baḥya's age. This is not a place, especially since the research on this subject has barely begun, to talk about the history of the reception of the Guide to the Duties of the Hearts. But it will suffice to say that the work was translated not once but twice in the 100 years that passed since it was authored by Baḥya, that the work has survived in more Geniza fragments than any other book of Jewish thought, including, for example, Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed or Saadia's Book of Doctrines and Beliefs. That it was one of the first books written by a Jewish thinker to be printed in Naples as early as 1490. And that throughout the early modern period, it was translated into more languages than any other such book. Languages such as Judeo-Italian, Judeo-German, Yiddish, Ladino, Portuguese, Dutch, and Latin, and I'm omitting a few more. The book's main reception was through the translation into Hebrew by Yehuda ibn Tibon, made in the 12th century, and from this translation it was retranslated into other languages. But the book was originally written, of course, in Judeo-Arabic. Moreover, as argued by scholars such as Ignaz Goldziher and David Hartwig Bannett in the early 20th century, and comprehensively demonstrated by Diana Lobel, with new studies by Binyamin Abrahamov and Ehud Krinis still probing the subject. Baḥya's work is not merely written in Arabic. Among Jewish thinkers, it exhibits the deepest and most fluent affinity to the world of Muslim erudition and religious sensibility. From the rhetoric Baḥya employs, to the essential motifs he integrates, to the religious currents he embraces from Islam, especially Muslim asceticism and the mystical Sufi branch that emerged from it, his work resonates profoundly with Islamic discourses. However, for our purposes, the primary concern is not what scholars show, however convincingly, about the book's integration and processing of Muslim sources, but rather to probe what can be gleaned from Baḥya's own assertions about his work in this regard. Here I want to turn first to the author's introduction to the work, and specifically the part where he addresses the method by which he wrote it and the sources he incorporates to illustrate, clarify, and ground his system. The book, Baḥya writes, and here see source number 1, is written mostly by way of rational arguments and analogues, which are the intellect's way of gaining knowledge and comprehend. Alongside these, Baḥya asserts his incorporation of sources, first and foremost from the Hebrew Bible, quote, the books of the prophets and the friends of God, the Awliya, end quote. Secondly, Baḥya asserts that he brought forth, quote, traditions of our sages, end quote. To these, Baḥya adds that he also integrated in his work sources by virtuous men and sages of every generation that we were informed of, end quote, in a hope that, quote, the souls will trust them and the hearts will heed to the understanding they have, end quote. Already here, the question arises, who are these pious men and sages of every generation, or virtuous men and sages of every generation? And the possibility arises that it is not only Jews. The possibility is confirmed immediately in the following sentence, in which Baḥya makes clear that the issue, that at issue are, quote, anecdotes of philosophers and virtuous manners and practices of the ascetics or people of asceticism in this world. This issue is not only confirmed, but also legitimated by Baḥya by using two rabbinic sources. One is cited from the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, which deals with the deeds of the Gentiles, and specifically the possibility that Gentiles will act in a way that will justify and even demand imitation. I quote, in one verse it is said, it's from Ezekiel chapter 11, after the ordinances of the nations that are round about you have ye done, וכמשפטי הגויים אשר סביבותיכם עשיתם. While in another it is said, it is from the same Ezekiel chapter 5, after the ordinances of the nations that are round about you, ye have not done, וכמשפטי הגויים אשר סביבותיכם לא עשיתם. How is this contradiction to be reconciled? As follows, their good ordinances ye have not imitated, their evil ones ye have followed. In essence, the virtuous deeds of the nations conducted outside the realm of the Jewish community are not merely subjects for observation by Jews, but also serve as models to be emulated. A second tradition is brought forth by Baḥya from Tractate Megillah from the same Babylonian Talmud, and it refers to what is conveyed in speech by the people of the nations. I quote, whoever utters a wise word, even if he belongs to the Gentiles, is called a sage, end quote. A few points are to be made regarding the introduction of these sources. Firstly, as Baḥya indicates, while these sources originate from the rabbinic canon, In their original context, they appear as part of a literary continuum, interwoven with opposing views within a literary corpus predominantly characterized by the tendency toward intensified distinction and binary opposition between the Jews and the Gentiles, a theme recently highlighted by Shai Rosenzweig and Adi Ophir. Secondly, Baḥya extracts these statements from their Talmudic sequence of the pericopes, transforming them into guiding, overarching principles that are to be employed throughout the composition of his work, establishes them as part of the methodical framework of his book, and put them into action by weaving in dozens of traditions which, as he remarks, derive from the practices of the asceticism of Gentiles. This approach is both intriguing and uncommon, diverging from the practice of incorporating quotations and adaptations of Arabic Islamic sources into Jewish writings without crediting their origins. Instead, in a work explicitly intended for Jewish addressees and focused on religious obligations, Baḥya openly acknowledges the incorporation of a stratum of sources originating from a non-Jewish context. Although it does not detail the specific works from which these were derived, he clearly indicates the importance of Muslim sources to both his book and his religious approach. The method Baḥya employs to signal the incorporation of these sources in his work is straightforward, establishing a nearly indexical marker for their recognition, in addition to other identifiers that emerge through the processing of the sources. Whenever phrases like it was said regarding one of the righteous, al-Salihun, one of the righteous said, it was narrated with regards to one of the righteous, or alternatively, reference to one of the ascetics, az-Zuhad, appear, it indicates that the source originates from an Islamic context. This is sometimes manifest using exact or nearly exact wording, including technical terminology of an Arabic source, or through what seems to be a subtle reworking of such a source. The provenance of these elements, as indicated by research to date, can be traced back to Zud, Adab, or Sufi literature. What do we learn from this issue about Baḥya's stance towards other religions or the plurality of religions? Here it seems that a clear statement can be made, albeit with caution. Both in his statement, which explains his intent in citing the rabbinic sources we mentioned, and throughout the book, Baḥya does not refer to religions in general, nor does he specifically refer to either Christianity or Islam by name. In any case, it is to be assumed that Christian sources were not even available to him. When using the term ascetics, it appears that Baḥya is referring only to Islam, and not to all Muslims, of course, but to a particular part and the unique religious trend within Islam. Nonetheless, it is worth noting that the Muslim sources Baḥya draws from, Zud literature, are themselves filled with references to Christians. Not all Christians, but specifically the ascetics among them, as those who share the religious path of asceticism and from whom there are lessons to be learned. Not only that, but from the fact that the practices of the ascetics are a valuable source for Baḥya, and that he himself turns to this literature and incorporates it, one can plausibly see a sign of the horizon Baḥya is setting for the intended readers of his book. It indicates, at least plausibly, that this literature should be viewed as an integral part of the initiation of those pursuing the proper religious path. It is possible that Muslim Zud literature, which, as I mentioned, includes a considerable number of references to Christianity, is presented here as a constituent of the ideal library one should embrace in the pursuit of religious perfection. Regardless of whether one accepts this hypothesis, it is clear that Baḥya acknowledges the existence of a plurality of religions. Moreover, he recognizes that among the followers of other religions, there are those from whom one can learn, one indeed ought to learn, and he himself draws upon their literature to forge and present his own religious understanding. A certain religious stratum, a non-Jewish religious elite, becomes a fellow pilgrim on the path to religious perfection. I wish to turn at this point to the second aspect I've mentioned at the beginning of my talk, which is the implicit, indirect approach that may be gathered from Baḥya's overall system to the members of other religions, or to the plurality of religions. To do this, I want to address one of the passages that begin with, "It was narrated regarding one of the righteous," and to read it with you for a moment in full. This passage is presented as part of Baḥya's discussion on one of the main religious principles, the struggle one has to conduct with one's worldly instinct or inclination, hawa, a principle to which he dedicates the larger part of the fifth among the 10 gates or parts of his work. This gate is located at the middle, that is, at the heart of the duties of the hearts. One's inclination, Baḥya asserts, and here I'm reading from source number 2, is incessantly and untiringly aiming to, quote, "destroy you in both worlds and uproot you from the two places, that is, this world and the hereafter." As said the friend of God, concerning one of the aspects and one of the soldiers of the inclination. And he brings a quote from Proverbs, "For she hath cast down many wounded, yea, a mighty host are all her slain. Her house is the way to the netherworld, going down to the chambers of death." A struggle against somebody else must not distract you from fighting him. No other battle should interfere with the struggle against him. Combating a far enemy must not keep you from engaging this one who is inseparable from you. Defending yourself against somebody who cannot attack you without permission must not stand in the way of defending yourself against this one who asks no permission to attack you. End quote. Firstly, the principle itself, the significance of combating one's inclination and recognizing this battle as the essence, according to Baḥya, of religious struggle, the one that will determine eventually one's individual reward, not only in this transient world, but also in the world to come, that is, for eternity. Elucidation of and emphasis on this principle are achieved by differentiating between the external enemy, with whom the battle ebbs and flows, and an internal enemy residing within a person. This internal battle, whether consciously acknowledged or not, is constantly waged to avert heresy and maintain the appropriate religious orientation. To exemplify this principle, Baḥya employs a verse from Psalms, which he attributes to the friend of God, the wali, significant appellation originating from Muslim context and consistently used by Baḥya in reference to the psalmist, a subject I've addressed in a different opportunity. In any case, Baḥya does not limit himself to this and proceeds to introduce a Muslim source. It is told of a righteous man, I quote, "It is told of a righteous man that he met some people returning from a great battle with an enemy. He said to them, 'You are returning, praised be God, from a smaller battle or a minor battle, jihad asghar, carrying your booty. Now prepare yourself for the great battle, jihad al-akbar.' They asked, 'What is that great battle?' And he answered, 'The battle against the instinct or inclination and its armies.'" End quote. The pivotal term in this passage is jihad, a concept deeply embedded within the Muslim context and exceedingly rare in texts authored by Jews. Here, Baḥya transforms it into a concept imbued with meaning for Jews. Specifically, he accentuates the distinction between the external struggle against infidels and the internal battle against one's inclination. The inner struggle is characterized as a confrontation with the root of heresy residing within an individual, which entices them to stray from the path of God. The earliest instances of this distinction, and actually of this very narrative, can be found in Muslim Zud literature from the 9th century, particularly in the works of the ascetic and mystic Al-Harith al-Muhasibi, whose writings have been linked to the Guide of the Duties of the Hearts by Amos Goldreich, who has also noted the wide dissemination of al-Muhasibi's works in Al-Andalus. Notably, apart from al-Muhasibi, the differentiation between the two forms of jihad also occupies a central position in other Zud texts. To understand the internal shift in the concept of jihad, it is necessary to outline in very broad strokes a historical transformation that occurred in Islam, primarily in and around Baghdad. Throughout the 7th century, battle zones and military expeditions were a prominent place where a devout Muslim seeking to fulfill his religious destiny might join. Jihad at the time was a warfare actively aimed at expanding the boundaries of Islam by fighting unbelievers and subjugating protected religious minorities. Indeed, the religious borders of Islam expanded immeasurably during this period. In the 8th century, as the military was professionalized and frontiers stabilized, something else was needed. A void emerged in the religious ethos. This led, as was remarked over the years through a long series of notes by Richard Gramlich, and more recently again by Chris Melchert, to a shift in the meaning of jihad, by a dynamic that aimed to preserve the merit of warfare or struggle, a legacy from the 7th century, under the new circumstances of the 8th and 9th. Consequently, the battle shifted inwards, demanding a campaign marked by an equally great, if not greater, such it was described, level of unwavering dedication, perseverance, and constancy. This struggle is now defined by a singular, transformative goal, reinterpreting the duty of combat in God's name as a set of ascetic practices in which one struggles inwardly. Of course, not all Muslims were ascetics, and among the religious currents in Islam, even those who accepted the importance of the principle of internal jihad, there were those who emphasized that the jihad of the soul, jihad an-nafs, does not take precedence over the external jihad. Rather, they were frequently seen as having equal status, or that the internal one serves as a preparation for the external, as Harry Neal has convincingly demonstrated. Nevertheless, within the Zud movement, one can explicitly point to the construction of an ethos that grants almost exclusive priority and precedence to the internal jihad, and which they call the great or the greater jihad, which is the religious virtue of struggling against the inclination residing within while marginalizing the war to impose Islam, now called the minor jihad, if not ignoring it altogether. The desire for struggle is no longer associated with identifying heresy beyond the border among non-Muslims, but with a much more internal battle between one and oneself in the presence of God's ever-penetrating gaze. The struggle against the inclination as the core of the religious war is not just another point, one among many in the ethos of asceticism. Rather, it becomes one of its central pillars. And just as it becomes an essential element in Zud literature, it also becomes a crucial religious principle in the Guide to the Duties of the Hearts. Baḥya embraces the struggle against the inclination, a significant issue already present in rabbinic literature, but now, in light of Muslim ascetic literature, he positions it against any other type of struggle against heresy. Now, for Baḥya too, the internal struggle is contrasted with the external one and presented as superior to it. What can be learned from this about the main issue that concerns us, about the question of the plurality of religions in the duties of the hearts? While there is no explicit statement here about the existence or value of other religions, the emphasis on the internal struggle as the essence of religious life implicitly frames the approach to other religions. The war against the enemy within the soul, and especially the declaration that this is an enemy from which there is no respite in the struggle, and that it is more cunning and cruel than any opponent, overshadows any other struggle. In other words, at the very least, there is a shift in the equilibrium here, diminishing the significance of the external other in religious life, even in a religious life that places struggle at its center. But perhaps there is more to it than that. As the struggle turns inward, focusing on combating the evil inclination to avoid succumbing to physical desires or cravings for honor or worldly status, and instead channeling and unifying one's passion solely towards the one God, the distinctions between different monotheistic religions might nearly vanish. In such conditions, which transform religious life into a predominantly mental endeavor with lesser emphasis on outward actions, a member of the Jewish community and a member of the Muslim community, and for that matter also possibly of a Christian community, may find themselves not as adversaries, but may see each other as taking part, each within one's own soul, in the same type of inner struggle. This is a situation that allows not only for the recognition of the existence of different religions, but also for the transformation of a member of another religion into an imagined mental brother in mental arms. Thank you.
Very much. Just a kind of clarifying question for myself here. So part of what I think I heard you maybe claim at the end is that if we think about the way that Baḥya's, if we sort of think about the way that Baḥya is sort of portraying a religious hierarchy, part of what I think I might have heard you say is that at the kind of top of this might be sort of asceticism and contemplative sort of approach to religion, sort of as a kind of genus, and then as species you might have Jewish mystics or Muslim mystics, Sufis. And so this seems to me that there might be, like he might be sort of constructing a hierarchy of religion, but not necessarily with different religions, but of forms of religion. Meaning that, would you say that for him kind of mysticism or ascetic sort of approaches to religion is the highest form of religion? And then we get these kind of variations depending on whether it's Jewish, Christian, Muslim.
Yeah, I think I understand the question. I will say two very brief things. One is I do not think that Baḥya aims at annihilating differences between the different religions. They stay as they are. I mean, his addressees are certainly Jews, and he speaks to them in the language of Jews. There are the 313 commandments that you should still follow, etc., etc. And I assume, I mean, it can be assumed, or there is nothing that hints otherwise, that these differences will probably stay as they are. But with regards to kind of the center of gravity of religious life, there can be in this specific area of religious life, there can be a kind of communionship or partnership. So it is not exactly a kind of a horizon of one religion that one's is directed at, but an area, a realm in which different members of Judaism, Islam, Christianity is not exactly in the picture, but may take part in. The other thing is that I think that Baḥya shift, and we discussed it a little bit earlier on, shift the focus between the way that different religions is the significant typology or taxonomy to be thought through, to the stratification or ranking within one's own religious milieu, and in which, as you turn more ascetic, and you can do it as a Christian, as a Jew, or as a Muslim, you are hierarchically superior or higher in the kind of religious path or the whole spectrum of religion, darajat.
Thank you so much. So our third speaker today is Jessica Andruss. Jessica Andruss is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. She studies medieval Jewish and Islamic cultural and intellectual history. Her research focuses on texts written by Jews in Arabic, from works of religious philosophy to translations and commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. Her first book, Jewish Piety in Islamic Jerusalem, was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. So thank you, Jessica.
Thank you very much. It's really wonderful to be here with you. I'm especially pleased to be speaking at the end of the conference because so many of the ideas that have been shared thus far have been very exciting to me. And I think that you'll see or you'll hear some echoes of some of the previous papers and what I have to say today. It has often been observed that Judaism and Islam are very close as far as religions go, that they are sister religions, that they share much in common with one another, that they are united through their strict monotheism, their focus on prophecy, their dedication to law, and it doesn't hurt that their prophets and their law overlap to such a degree. In our own time, and especially in context of interreligious dialogue, such close connections are celebrated. Maimonides, the Jewish legal thinker, philosopher, and communal leader of the 12th century Islamic world, also noticed the affinities between Judaism and Islam. Yet for Maimonides, the very similarity or proximity of the traditions was cause for concern. He wrote his Epistle to Yemen in response to a Yemenite Jewish leader who feared that the local Jewish community was becoming conflicted and confused about their Jewish commitments, precisely because the Islamic tradition, which was politically powerful, so closely resembled their own. The very similarities between Judaism and Islam could deceive Jews into abandoning their ancestral faith. Maimonides crafted his letter to encourage this Jewish community to remain faithful to Judaism. In addition to his reassuring words, Maimonides presents a schematic history of religions to explain the origins of Christianity and Islam, to convince the Jews of Yemen that both of these religions had been foretold by the prophet Daniel, and that their rise as global empires signifies the advent of the Messiah, not the transfer of divine affection away from the Jews. In this framework, the world religions are placed chronologically and theologically in relation to Judaism. In my presentation today, I aim to show how Maimonides constructs a spatial framework for comparing religions, evaluating them in terms of their proximity or similarity to Judaism. Maimonides' typology is based in religious and political history. He begins with biblical references to the enemies of Israel and follows the pattern to his own day, identifying rival communities and explaining the nature of their attacks on Judaism. Maimonides' Epistle to Yemen, the focus of my remarks, is but one letter among many within his vast corpus of writings on an array of subjects. The content and tone of this letter are not representative of his corpus as a whole, nor of his approach to Islam and Christianity and other works. So it is important to describe the unique historical, literary, and communal circumstances of the epistle before proceeding. By the end of the 12th century, Moses Maimonides was the respected leader of the Egyptian Jewish community, one of the most prominent Jewish communities of the medieval Islamic world. His renown as a philosopher and legal thinker was widespread. In 1172, he received an urgent letter from Rabbi Jacob ben Netanel, the leader of the Jewish community of Yemen, requesting his guidance. Although Jacob's letter is no longer extant, Maimonides' response, known as the Epistle to Yemen, is preserved to this day. In fact, it was translated from Arabic into Hebrew 3 times during his life or shortly thereafter, indicating its usefulness for a broader audience. Maimonides asked Jacob to transmit its contents to all, women and children included, and he urged him to take care in concealing it from non-Jews. Through Maimonides' response to Jacob ben Netanel's letter, we learn that Jacob was concerned about the threat of apostasy among the Jews of Yemen. The Jewish community there was apparently bewildered by Muslim arguments, sometimes made by friends and relatives who had apostatized from Judaism. That Judaism had been supplanted by Islam, the prophet Moses had been succeeded by the prophet Muhammad, and the Torah had been superseded by the Quran. Jacob asked Maimonides how he should respond to such arguments in order to mitigate their harm to the vulnerable Jewish community of Yemen. Jacob's reports of Jewish confusion are hardly surprising. We know of medieval Jewish groups, both within Arabia and beyond, who did believe in the prophethood of Muhammad. Indeed, Jacob's own father, Rabbi Netanel ibn Fayumi, who lived from 1090 to 1165 or thereabouts, wrote in his Bustan al-Aqul that Muhammad was a prophet and messenger of God, although his message was directed only to the pagan Arabs and therefore did not apply to the Jews. It could be that Jacob requested Maimonides' intervention not only for the sake of his community, but for his own clarification as well. Maimonides responds to the Yemenite confusion about the relative truth of Judaism and Islam by constructing a counter-history of religions. Although he draws upon pre-existing motifs, for example, the notion of the 4 empires that persecute the Jewish people in advance of the Messianic era, or the polemical account of Jewish elders composing the Quran and inventing Islam, the precise response that Maimonides formulates is distinctly his own. He attempts to reassure Jacob, and by extension the Jews of Yemen, that Judaism is the only true religion, and that Islam is merely a copy of it. The biblical prophets have already predicted these pretenders, Jesus and Muhammad, and the religions that follow them. These religions, which so closely resemble Judaism, were created only as an attack against it. Maimonides focuses repeatedly on the similarities between Judaism and Islam, as these are the red flags that one is a copy of the other. Only an examination of their inner meanings prove that one is authentic, divine, while the other is manufactured. It is in his historical discussion of the emergence of the rival religions that Maimonides explains why these counterfeit religions were invented at all. Let us turn to that history now. Maimonides' schema of history is decidedly Judeo-centric. He divides history into 3 phases. In the first, most ancient phase, the nations attacked Israel through violent military conquest. This group is represented by Amalek, Sisera, Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, Titus, Hadrian, and, quote, others like them, Israel's ancient foes whose brutalities are recorded in Scripture. In the second historical phase, Israel was attacked instead by means of arguments and religious controversies. This phase is represented by, quote, the most intelligent and educated among the nations, like the Syrians, Persians, and Greeks. Although their strategies differed, both kinds of enemies attacked Israel for the same reason. These nations were jealous of Israel because God had chosen them and given them his law. Thus, their goal was to destroy that law. In Maimonides' words, ever since the time of the revelation, every despot or rebel ruler, be he violent or ignoble, has made it his first aim and his final purpose to destroy our religion. And by the way, religion here and in much of the epistle to Yemen is Sharia. Thus, during the period of sovereignty and in the years of exile, Jews have been harassed and distressed by the nations. Now, there is a third phase in Maimonides' history of religions, and I'll describe that in a moment. Let's pause here, though, to consider Maimonides' division of the nations on the basis of their strategies for attempting to annihilate the Jewish people and destroy their law. This division forms one component of Maimonides' typology, in which all non-Jewish religions arose to harm Jews and end Judaism, whether by the sword or by intellectual attack. Maimonides' chronological presentation of Israel's enemies, beginning with the most ancient ones and working his way forward through history, resembles the familiar Jewish motif of the four kingdoms or four empires. This motif is connected to a prophecy in the biblical book of Daniel. The prophet experiences a vision of the end times and notes that they will be preceded by the rise of four kingdoms. In rabbinic sources, these kingdoms are identified as Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. In other words, the last of the four kingdoms intersects with the rabbi's own time, signaling that the messianic age will soon be upon them. Medieval interpreters, who had to account for additional centuries of delay before the Messiah's arrival, often disagreed about how to identify the kingdoms. The question of where to place the Arabic Islamic Empire within the schema was one of their major stumbling blocks. Some linked the Fourth Empire to both Edom and Ishmael, that is to say, Christendom and Islamdom, while others left Arabs outside the framework altogether, differentiating them from the evil empires because, even though the Arabs certainly humiliated the Jews, they had not sent them into exile or attempted to destroy them altogether as the preceding empires had. In presenting ancient history as a series of attempts to destroy Israel and eradicate divine law, Maimonides adapts the four empires motif for his own purposes. And just as the four kingdoms motif culminates in one way or another with the eras of Christianity and Islam, so does Maimonides in his epistle. In the third phase, the phase in which Maimonides and Jacob ben Netanel lived, the enemies of Israel combine both methods, attacking Jews via military might and also unsettling Jewish belief through a devious form of religious fraud. As Maimonides explains, and this is the first passage on the handout, the third kind of enemy therefore resolved to lay claim to prophecy and to found a new law contrary to our divine religion, and to contend that it also came from God, like the true claim. Thus, doubts will be generated and confusion will be created, since one is opposed to the other, and both supposedly emanated from one God, and it will lead to the destruction of both religions. This is a remarkable plan contrived by a person who is envious and malicious, who will strive to kill his enemy and remain alive, and if he cannot achieve this, he will devise a scheme whereby they both will be slain. Note the extreme nature of Maimonides' claim. These enemies are so determined to destroy Judaism that they will stop at nothing, even their own demise, to accomplish that goal. The third form of warfare was invented by Jesus, continued by Christians, emulated by Muhammad, and perfected by Muslims. Maimonides' presentation of this deceitful strategy merits quotation at length. The first to institute this plan was Jesus the Nazarene, may his bones be ground to dust. He impelled people to believe that he was sent by God to clarify perplexities in the Torah and that he was the Messiah predicted by each and every prophet. His purpose was to interpret the Torah in a fashion that would lead to its total annulment, to the abolition of its commandments, and to the violation of all its prohibitions. The sages of blessed memory, aware of his objective before his reputation spread among the people, meted out a fitting punishment. Daniel had already alluded to him when he presaged the downfall of a wicked and heretical Jew who would endeavor to destroy the law, claim prophecy for himself, make pretense to miracles, and allege that he was the Messiah. Quite some time later, a religion, which is traced to him by the descendants of Esau, gained popularity. Although this was the aim he hoped to realize, he had no impact on Israel, as neither groups nor individuals became unsettled in their beliefs. In Maimonides' telling, The origins of Christianity and Islam are rooted in the same malicious desire to annul God's law that motivated the ancient nations to attack Israel in battle. Jesus pretended to clarify perplexities in Torah when his true purpose was to undermine it entirely. His religious teachings were formulated to resemble the true religion in order to confuse Jews and lead them away from divine law. Note that Maimonides positions Jesus as a founding figure, but attributes the rise and spread of Christianity to a later period and process. Most importantly, Maimonides asserts that neither Jesus nor the religion that he inspired posed a credible threat to the Jewish community. Jesus' claims of prophethood, messiahship, and miracle-making were so transparently false that no Jews, individually or collectively, were swayed to the Christian cause. Maimonides considers Muhammad to be another example of the same phenomenon, another species of the same genus. In fact, he states that Muhammad followed in the footsteps of Jesus, inventing a new religion designed to confuse Jews and lead the community to ruin. The quotation continues. After Jesus, the madman arose, who emulated the precursor who had paved the way for him. But he added the further objective of procuring rule and obedience, and he invented his notorious religion. Unlike Jesus and Christians, however, Muhammad and his community made some inroads in their mission of confusing and converting Jews. Maimonides explains this success in terms of the proximity between Islam and Judaism. In Maimonides' schema, the most proximate religions were the most threatening. Thus, Islam is more threatening than Christianity, and, as Maimonides states elsewhere in the Epistle to Yemen, Jewish heretics were more threatening still. For Maimonides, the similarities between Judaism and Islam are not accidental, but by design. Muhammad deliberately constructed a religious system so similar to Judaism that it would be mistaken for the true religion. His prophethood resembles true prophethood, that is to say, Mosaic prophethood. His law resembles Jewish law, and his Quran resembles Torah. The similarity between the religions is so problematic that Maimonides devotes considerable space to alerting Jacob to its dangers and instructing him in how to convince his community that Islam is false in spite of its proximity to Judaism. He writes, "All of these men wish to liken themselves to the divine religion, but only a simpleton who lacks knowledge of both establishments will liken the divine institutions to human contrivances." Maimonides produces an analogy to make his point. He compares the relationship between Judaism and false religions to the relationship between a real human being created by God and a mere statue. This quotation is also on the handout. The difference between our religion and the other denominations that liken themselves to us is like the difference between the living, rational individual and the statue skillfully molded out of marble, wood, silver, or gold that looks like a man. A person ignorant of divine wisdom or of God's work, when he sees that statue that superficially resembles a man in its contours, form, features, and color, believes that its structure is like the constitution of a man because he lacks the knowledge of the inner organization of both. But the informed person who knows the interior of both knows that the internal composition of the statue betrays no skillful workmanship at all, whereas the inward parts of man are truly marvelously made, a testimony to the wisdom of the Creator. When Maimonides compares Judaism to Islam, or a human being to a statue, the similarities are obvious, but they are entirely superficial. As the passage continues, Maimonides draws from his extensive medical knowledge to describe the inner anatomy of the human being, tracing muscles and joints, nerves and vessels. His knowledge of the inner workings of human physiology gives the lie to any ostensible similarity between this miraculous creation and a man-made statue. In the same way, Maimonides urges his audience to consider the inner meaning of Jewish law. Quote, "A person ignorant of the secrets of the revealed books and the inner significance of our law will be led to believe that our religion has something in common with the established confession if he makes a comparison between the two. The pretentious religions contain matters that have no inner meaning, only imitations, simulations, and copies by which the inventors aim to glorify themselves and indulge in the fancy that they are similar to so-and-so." So we have a central binary here between the true and the false, those that have insides and those that are merely artifice. And the other gradations can fit into this binary. Similarity ceases to mislead, but only when the inner meaning is considered. The apparent similarities between Judaism and Islam belie the profound internal differences between them. In comparing religions, Maimonides develops a spatial framework with Judaism at its core. One axis measures proximity and distance, or similarity and difference, and the other mentions internal and external dimensions. Measures internal and external dimensions. The religion that most resembles Judaism in its external aspects poses the greatest risk to the Jewish community. Jews might be attracted to a religion that closely resembles their own, particularly when Muslims also emphasize the similarity between the two traditions. Indeed, Muslim awareness of similarities between Judaism and Islam is rooted in the Quran. There, Muhammad is commanded to tell those who disbelieve in his revelation that, quote, a witness from the Israelites bore witness to the Quran and believed in it. That's Surah 46, verse 10. Muslim interpreters identified that witness from the Israelites as the prophet Moses himself. In other words, Muslims contend that Moses testified that Muhammad's revelation is similar to his, and that Muhammad is a prophet like him. Hadith materials emphasize this similarity. In one such report, Muhammad tells his followers, quote, if Moses were alive and became aware of my prophethood, he would follow me. And I really had my pick of hadith to emphasize this point. There are many that emphasize this point. And this is what Shari Lawan, for example, refers to as the Moses-ness of Muhammad that early transmitters of hadith were very interested in. Jews found this logic compelling long before the exchange of letters between Maimonides and Jacob ben Netanel. Indeed, the Sirah tradition tells of Jews in the Arabian Peninsula who made the same calculation early in Muhammad's prophetic mission. The similarities between Moses and Muhammad convinced them to accept Muhammad as a new prophet of the same lineage as Moses. Abdullah ibn Salam, known as the first Jewish convert to Islam, tells his skeptical aunt that he will follow Muhammad because he is, quote, the brother of Moses and follows his religion. Maimonides, however, refutes the notion that similarity means equivalence. On the contrary, outward similarity is the hallmark of a copy, a fake. As he explains in the Epistle, the scripture and law of Islam are mere imitations of Torah and Jewish law. Quote, the pretentious religions, and again, notice that typology, right? A true religion and pretentious ones. The pretentious religions contain matters that have no inner meaning, only imitations, simulations, and copies by which the inventors aim to glorify themselves and indulge in the fancy that they are similar to so-and-so. The claim that the Quran is not an authentic revelation is familiar, not only from Quranic references to disbelievers who accused Muhammad of composing it, but also from Jewish sources that circulated throughout the Islamic world, alleging that the Quran was composed by Jewish elders, oftentimes named. These elders left clues within the Quran that point to their authorship, and they invented Islam so that, quote, nothing would harm Israel, although the exact means by which the forgery would avert harm is not spelled out. In Maimonides' epistle, however, it is Muhammad who composes the Quran, and his purpose is to harm Israel. Maimonides taps into the charge that the Quran was not divinely revealed, but he places Muhammad as the forger of this document. Muhammad's intention was to craft a scripture and a religion that so closely resembled Judaism that even Jews would mistake its superficial similarity for authentic truth, a legitimate continuation of their own prophetic tradition. The proximity of Judaism and Islam is itself a red flag for Maimonides. His prophetology allows for non-Israelite prophets, at least hypothetically, as long as their message is identical to those of the biblical prophets who came before them. In the case of Islam, however, similarity is not identity, and that is the problem. The religions that lie farther afield of Judaism on the axis of proximity and distance are easier to recognize for the fakes that they are. Within Maimonides' spatial comparative framework, Christianity, Islam, and Jewish heretics are the hardest to recognize in that order because of their similarities to and affinities with Judaism. Maimonides' history of religions, or we might say his counter-history of religions, operates within a polemical framework. More even-handed scholarly treatments of religious diversity exist in his other writings. But to make that observation is not to distance Maimonides from the schema that he promotes in the Epistle to Yemen, and it is not to explain it away by invoking Maimonides' concern for the Jews of Yemen and their vulnerability to Islamic arguments about the similarities between the two traditions. The epistle circulated widely, and it offers a genuine medieval Jewish taxonomy of religion and religious development, with Judaism at its center, and other religions measured by their proximity or distance, however overdetermined, from it. Thank you.
Thanks. That was fantastic. I'm curious about. So, we often talk about a logic of suspicion in hermeneutics, where we sort of start from the assumption that whatever's going on, we have to be suspicious about it and resist it. And this certainly is going on with Maimonides. But I'm wondering whether this isn't a hermeneutics of gaslighting, because that seems to me he's arguing for a sort of process of Gentile gaslighting. That's how he sees, and it's interesting to think about religious difference as a product of strategic misrepresentation, so that it's not just a matter of, it's not an ontological matter, it's a strategic ethical matter for him. That the reason these faiths are particularly dangerous is because the people engaging in them are doing so with a hostile intent to misrepresent and to camouflage. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that camouflaging, that gaslighting, because I think that's the best term I can think of for what you're describing.
Thank you. I think one aspect in play here is the slippage between the founders, these foundational religious figures, and the religious communities of hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands that come after them. I noticed the slippage even in the language of the text. There's a place where he says something like, these men, referring to Jesus and Muhammad, are the subject of the sentence. And then in his verbs, he's suggesting the communities or perhaps the religions. I think he says something like, these men pretend to be the religions of God, or something like this, where it's clear that there's not a match there. And so, whereas I think it's a different sort of case to be made that one individual, for particular psychological reasons, wanted to mount this sort of attack, versus that a whole community of faithful believers is complicit in this attack, or perhaps has the same sort of agenda. And I think that that's one place where things break down, because Maimonides does take some time with both Jesus and Muhammad to produce a sort of pre-modern psychological profile of these figures as disturbed, and that's motivating this action that he might also call gaslighting, were he familiar with the term. But to ascribe those motivations to the entire community centuries afterwards, I think is trickier. Now, he does get at this elsewhere in the letter when he talks about polemical arguments that Muslims marshal, that they don't even believe themselves. So he does try to address this, that this could be a kind of mass deception, but I think that that's a harder argument to make.
Hello.
It says dead battery.
Okay, I will use this, but we have another one, right? Do they all work?
Yes.
Okay. Jessica, thank you so much. I wanted to ask, sorry for hijacking the discussion, but just for a brief question. You, you presented compellingly this idea that the closer one is, the more dangerous one is. And then you said that okay, Muslims are more dangerous than Christians, and the heretics are more dangerous than Muslims. But I'm wondering whether first heretics are really dangerous in this sense, because they still see themselves as being part of the community. Somehow they are part. I don't know how they see themselves. But maybe the category of converts, of converts out of willingness, not the forced converts, may be the most dangerous, because they not only look similar, or maybe living partly in a similar manner, with whatever they retained from their Judaism, but they know how to speak from within. They know the traditions, they know how to work with them, they know the ones that produce discomfort. And here, these may be the ones who are the closest to the gates of the community. And I wonder what... Okay.
Thank you. Yes, I hear what you're saying. It's too bad that Boyd has left, because I was very interested in his categories from Bacon and so on, of the schismatic and the heretic, and those who are part but not apart. But I agree that. And I'm not alone. I think medieval Muslims also saw the great advantages of having enthusiastic, willing Jews who became Muslims speak to both audiences about the superiority of Islam. And so I think you're absolutely right that by virtue of their not just knowledge, but in some sense, continued belonging to the Jewish community is tricky. And I think that apostates and heretics also play interesting roles in those points. The degree to which they are recognized by different parties as still being part of the Jewish community makes them very tricky figures when coming to issues like trust and skepticism.
I think that this question is primarily for Omer, but also for Jessica. I think a loose end in a couple of these papers is the external appropriation of revealed data from within a tradition that is of questionable provenance by that own tradition's standards. So, for example, the Al-Jihad al-Azghar, that hadith is really weak, and maybe by when Al-Muhasabi and others first start to use it, that wasn't recognized. But certainly later in the Middle Ages, that it was well known that this wasn't a great tradition, great by the standards of ilm al-hadith, but yet you've got a Jewish thinker that grabs it because he likes the idea and really strips it of its I'll call it revealed context within Islam. And and then so I thought about this when you, Jessica, mentioned the some of the Moses hadiths. And there you've got a Muslim making the argument, but again, I mean, hadiths that by the standards of ilm al-hadith are also not great. So I suppose my question is about the some comments about the external appropriation of things that are questionable. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Okay? That's a really wonderful comment, and I think that one of the openings provided by this conference and these kinds of researches is that we can bring the Islamic and Jewish sources together. So the evaluation, for example, of the Ahl al-Hadith is not the final standard as to whether this is compelling or legitimate or has legs, so to speak. And that these two traditions can cross-reference each other in interesting ways, even if the chronologies are different and the chains of transmission are different, that we can think, for example, about Jewish communities as inheriting and transmitting hadith, even hadith that may not continue to be popular in some regions or communities of the Islamic world. And on the flip side of that coin, that we can look within hadith for evidence of Jewish attitudes about the Prophet Muhammad or the rise of Islam or areas of shared concern when the Jewish sources themselves are silent on those questions, or maybe the Jewish sources are 200, 300 years later. And so I think we are able to have conversations in this room that the hadith never would have had, and that's a good thing that I want to embrace together here.
Thank you. And what I find with Baḥya both interesting and uncommon is not only that he grabs a hadith and integrates it into his work, but that he manifestly does it. I mean, first by using this Jewish hadith of saying whatever message from Umot HaOlam, from the Gentiles, whenever he speaks a wise word, he is considered a wise person. That is someone who one has to listen to or has to take into regard, and also by not reworking this hadith in a way that will hinder the traces of it. I mean, he does not use jihad by mistake, and it is a term that you do not see other Jews having in their works, and I think that in Baḥya's case, it is not just the way in which Muslim traditions were integrated, but something else, at least by degrees, taking place, which is manifesting this, and I try to probe the meaningfulness of manifesting the fact that you are integrating a Muslim source and you index it by saying it was said with regards to one of the ascetics or one of the righteous.
My question was for something that you briefly mentioned that my kind of ears pricked up, and I'm not sure that I fully got what you were saying. But you had mentioned this sort of concept of the descendants of Ishmael sort of being integrated or assimilating this sort of Arab identity to such an extent that it was like a second birth. Could you say more?
So
just in general about
this comes out of the they're not religious, the disputes between like North Arabs and South Arabs. Like they're always fighting each other about their genealogies and battles and merits and all that. And one of the the North Arabs claim to descend from Ismail, right? Who then the South Arabs say to them, but he's not like, that means you're descended from Abraham. You're not like Arab according to whatever category. And this is the sort of kind of answer that is given, that he came there and miraculously learned Arabic and intermarried, and that's fine, not a problem. The idea of a second birth I think is probably from like Hellenistic sources, most likely, like because there is this idea of custom as a second nature. Yeah, and so the question is this did the descendants of Ismail take on Arabness as a through custom, as a second nature, through culture, or Jāḥiẓ is saying no, it's deeper than that. But, yeah.
My question was also about Arab identity and the qualification, that's not the right word, but the criteria, and how that was kind of an expanding list, right, by language or by custom or by this or that or the other. And I was curious whether Al-Jāḥiẓ has some sort of limit, like you need to check 2 out of 3 boxes or something, if it's an all or nothing situation, or if there can be gradations. And just the whole formulation seemed to me so, I mean, as with so much of his work, ahead of his time in the sense of a certain malleability of identity that we associate mostly with the modern world. And I'd just like to hear your thoughts about that.
So yeah, I do think Jāḥiẓ has this almost sort of some of the things he says sound almost postmodern in how he thinks about the flexibility of different categories and their like non-essentialness. Of course, at the same time, he was like even more hierarchical in his like brutal establishment of social hierarchies than even his peers at the time. So it's important we don't get carried away in that direction. As far as Arabness, this is an area of current research. Like I think that in Arabic, classical Arabic and Islamic studies, like critical race theory has been like, or any kind of critical approach to ethnicity has been really not applied sufficiently until very, very recently. So there's like new research coming out now that is changing some of these ideas, which can't fully articulate for you, but you could look at like some writings of, I think, Nathaniel Miller and Peter Webb, who've been talking about this. And so a lot of the theories of Arab identity that are being described in Jāḥiẓ are probably don't go back to the Arabian Peninsula, like by any means at all. In fact, this term Adnan that refers to the North Arabians, which is the category of Arabs that Jāḥiẓ is discussing, it's been like, I think it's Nathaniel Miller, I think, or Peter Webb, anyway, one of them has argued that this is like a post-Islamic category, essentially, that comes up to have this concept of a pan-Arab identity. And then it gets assigned this tribal name with like a genealogical element to it, whereas previously there's like a history to it that does not reflect the way Jāḥiẓ uses the term. That was not a great answer, but at least I pointed you where the answers lie.
I also had a question that's kind of related to these questions of ethnicity in Al-Jāḥiẓ. So I was intrigued by the passage that you showed where he's saying that these miracles of Christ, they're not known by, and then he has a very long list of nations. And I agree that it's interesting that how he mixes certain nations, and then with religion, suddenly these Buddhists appear amongst the nations. But the list of nations kind of rang a bell with me because it's often what Christians say when Muslims make the argument that everything that Islam has come with is so clearly overpoweringly true that how can Christians keep on believing, in all these weird doctrines of theirs, while the plainness of the truth of Islam is there. And for many centuries, and also already so early as the time of Al-Jāḥiẓ, they would make lists of all the nations that accept Christianity. And it's always like, the Bulgars and the Alans and the Georgians and I think also the Daylamites. I was thinking, since when are Daylamites also Christian? But I guess Syriac Christianity was there in Daylam, I don't know. And then it often also goes to Sudan, and the list gets longer over time. And I was wondering whether maybe he...
Sorry, but who's listing the Christian nations and for what purpose?
I found this in so many texts. I would have to look it up.
But what's the argument like?
The argument is then that well, you can't say it is kind of the argument of a religious group that's been kind of turned into minority, but they don't like to think, of course, of themselves as a subjected minority. So they still think they're like kings of the world, and all the important kings of the world also believe in Christianity, and all these people. So here in Baghdad, it may seem as though Islam is the religion, but actually the whole world believes in Christianity. That was one part of the argument. Another thing was that everyone has their Bible, and it's translated into so many different languages, and yet the content is the same everywhere. Not only is that as such an argument for the kind of consistency of the Bible, but it's also a technical argument against the idea of tahrif, because imagine that somebody had said, okay, something has to be changed in the Bible. We want to take out the name of Muhammad so that people won't recognize this upcoming prophet. Then it would have been impossible for all these people from these various nations to come together and make exactly the same changes. So sometimes it also comes up in that context. I'm curious to what extent, or whether it's possible that Al-Jāḥiẓ was also aware with this kind of Christian argument at the time.
Well, that's really fascinating. And thank you for telling me about that, because if so, that's like a real flip on its head of that, like sort of list of nations strategy. And so I want to look further and try to see about that. That's great. Thank you. And the translation argument too is sort of inverted. That's very interesting.
And I also thought if it makes sense to think that Al-Jāḥiẓ is like thinking about all these nations, because he is also often like toiling with this idea of ijma, in the sense of whether disagreement also points to untruth in a way. It's so nice for Muslims amongst each other to believe that something is true because everybody believes it. I mean, it's famous that this concept is discussed already in the beginning with my community cannot agree on error, etc. It's all very fine if it's internally in your community, but as soon as people start to challenge you on that, it's difficult. So I think Jāḥiẓ also talks about the crucifixion. If communities cannot, if truth cannot be, if untruth cannot be spread by a community, how is it possible that all the Jews and all the Christians in history have always believed that Christ has been crucified, right? Even though they are also even opposing communities, so they could not get together and make something up. And we as Muslims now say that this crucifixion didn't happen, then it's more likely that the ijma of these other communities actually counts and that we don't. I don't know if he kind of defends it or something, but I remember that it comes up. So when that your passage seems to be related a bit to this question of how knowledge, how general knowledge comes into being.
And the idea of universality, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'll check that too. Thank you.
I don't know if you included anything of this Hujjaz and Nabuwa, because there he talks about how universal knowledge can be real or not, you know. So.
Yeah, thank you.
And then, sorry to go on, but another thing I was thinking about, I also wanted to ask you something, but now I'm just targeting you. The whole question about what it is to the one thing, okay, what makes you Arab? How did Ismail become Arab? But how do you say? And also the question of all these various nations. I was wondering to what extent he ever reflects on the question of the connection between ethnicity and Islam in the context of the discussions about the Shu'ubiyya, because he is also interested in the question of whether Persians can be as fully Muslim as Arabs can, right? So I was wondering if for him there's this question to what extent true religious identity is attached to your ethnic identity or not. But I don't remember any other passages where he would be reflecting on that.
Yeah. My general sense from him is that he is orienting us towards Arabic as a criterion rather than ethnic Arabness as a criterion. Like, that's my interpretation of his stance in these disputes about ethnicity and Islam in this time period. But I know that other people have interpreted his like broad corpus differently. So, that's how I'm seeing it. But maybe I have rosy-colored glasses. I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I sort of when thinking about universality, like one thing that I've been thinking about throughout the conference has been this idea that one religion follows the next, right? And like supplants it with overt and covert borrowings. Because it is similar to this idea of translatio, translatio imperii, of empires supplanting one another. And in fact, it's Dimitri Gutatz's argument about the Abbasid translation movement, that it's drawing on Sasanian imperial ideology, which was itself religious, kind of brings together those ideas of like religion following religion and empire following empire. And so, there was this idea that like, oh, we're translating Hellenistic materials into Pahlavi, but that's actually the Avesta that was dispersed when Alexander the Great conquered. It kind of reminded me of what you were talking about of like, oh, well, Ka'b al-Ahbar can actually give us the original Torah. So now Muslims are able to supply the original Torah, which is like lost among the Jews. This idea that trying to find ways where like your new supplanting empire or religion is able to somehow like be the original in a way that the original group cannot. I was going to ask you about overt and covert. Like, you're pointing to the ways that Ibn Paduka is naming his Muslim sources as Muslim, tagging them. But like, does he also have untagged Islamic sources? And is there kind of a, dance between that?
So the answer is yes. That there are covert incorporations of sources, and I think that not coincidentally. I mean that when he identifies with a specific corpora of Muslim sources, it is from Zud, broadly speaking, with which he kind of makes the rapport, makes the relationship, and you could, but you can see some other quotations or reworkings of other sources, sometimes even other hadith materials, in which he will not say that they come from anywhere. They will just be part of the discourse. What I wanted to say about the last point that you made before the question is that even when sources coming from other places are presented as some kind of either original Torah or original what have you, it is still, even if they call it original Torah, it is the Torah that we don't know. I mean, because foreignness is retained, but it is tagged as something that originally belongs to us. But it's still, I mean, the fact that one says that it's the Avesta or it's the original Torah or it's the what have you, does not eradicate the foreignness, at least with respect to some of the inner audiences, the intra-religious audiences, because it is not the Torah that you consider as canonical. It is not what you have as canonical, but it's something that is either to replace or supplement or doing other things.
It's an appropriation.
Yeah, and still retained as, I mean, the fact that one calls something the original Torah, still with regards to whoever considered the Torah as we know it as canonical, even if it will be called the original Torah, it will be seen as otherwise than what was considered thus far as the original Torah.
this is a big question, but it's fine because we're done. And I'm curious about, so religious difference in ranking religions, the theme of the conference. Something keeps popping up, and I'm curious about how you think about these two terms in relationship to each other. Is supersessionism versus subordination? Because one of the things I'm thinking about is the historical framing of religious difference as things that unfold in time. The supersessionist doctrine that's certainly there for Christianity replacing Judaism in its own sort of self-narrative, and Islam's own self-narrative, it's supplanting Judaism, and then it's Christianity as well as Judaism. And then Judaism doesn't participate in that supersessionist discourse in the same sort of way, and instead there's this kind of idea of almost like a gaslighting one, that people have come along and tried to fool us into thinking that they've got a new answer when we've always had the answer in the first place. But then we've also got supplantation or subordination. So like I'm thinking of the way the Muslims thought of Zoroastrianism, that they didn't supersede it, they just kicked it out of the way because it was dumb. And so I'm wondering how those two phenomena perhaps play into the way that these different faith traditions in the Middle Ages understand their own, the way they see how things stack up in terms of what comes what. Because what I'm really hearing is there's a fairly strong binary at work. There's us, we're the best, and the others are just kind of not. And yeah, so they're maybe a little closer to us, maybe a little not, and it depends. But that would fit with the supersessionist model, wouldn't it? And I haven't really heard much talk about supersessionism, so I'm curious.
So just to begin by answering and connecting it to the last little conversation we had, with regards to supersessionism makes it in a way easier to integrate sources from the tradition that you supersede. Because when you have the Islamic trope or motif of we confirm the earlier Christian and Jewish revelations, in this case, using a Jewish tradition might not be necessarily a bad thing, because this is said to be confirmed at least in some way. For Jews to integrate Muslim sources, it does not have these resources to do it. Just saying that it is part of our long story in any way whatsoever. And so at least in this case, there is a difference between a Muslim integrating a Jewish source and a Jew integrating a Muslim source into one's work. That does not mean that it's always overt, but in many cases it's covered, but still.
You know, I feel that way in class. This isn't like a class, obviously, but I do feel that way in class sometimes when I can just let my students keep talking, and it's just because something was introduced the right way that made something interesting to discuss. So I'm, you know, I guess I'm supposed to make concluding remarks about the conference. I'm way too tired and burnt out at this point to make any meaningful concluding remarks, but you know, for me, this has just been really wonderful, and so I just want to thank all the speakers once again. I'd like to thank Dan once again, and Camille once again.